The sun hung mercilessly over the Arizona territory, flattening the world into a blistered, shimmering haze as the wind scraped sand across the ground like broken glass. And this was the terrain where Jedediah Cole, known in those parts simply as Jed, rode alone toward Fort Thatcher with a sack of mail slung behind him and a nagging chill in his gut that something wasn't right. It was a feeling he'd learned to trust in his years, drifting between cattle trails, frontier towns, and the dead spaces in between where the law faded and humanity sometimes did too. And today that instinct sharpened the moment he spotted the crude wooden cage half buried in the sand like a forgotten coffin. Jed slowed his horse, the animal snorting as if it too sensed the wrongness in the air. And what he first thought was an empty holding pen, one of those temporary structures soldiers used during prisoner transfers, revealed a faint movement, barely more than the flutter of a rag in the wind. At first he thought it was an injured coyote, then perhaps a dying outlaw, but when he dismounted and got closer he saw her, the young Apache woman curled against the splintered boards, her figure gaunt, her hair tangled with dust, her lips cracked from thirst. Yet even in her suffering, she held a fierce dignity. In the way her eyes met his, slowly, silently, defiantly, Jed froze with a heaviness in his chest. He knew what this was. The fort sometimes transported Apache prisoners north, and not every commander had patience or mercy. Someone had abandoned her, maybe thinking she wouldn't survive the journey, maybe thinking no one would ever find her. Jed cursed under his breath. He had seen cruelty before, but something about this hit him deeper. Maybe because she looked so young, maybe because the desert had already claimed too many souls for one lifetime. He approached slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm, and she tried to pull back, though she didn't have the strength, her breathing shallow, her body trembling. He knelt and said softly, "Easy. I ain't here to hurt you," though he doubted she understood the words. Still, something in his tone must have reached her because her shoulders loosened a fraction. The cage door was tied shut with thick, sun-hardened rope, so he drew his knife, slicing through the fibers until the knot fell away. And when he pushed the boards open, she collapsed forward, and he caught her instinctively, feeling how fragile she'd become, as light as a half-filled sack of grain. He carried her to the shade of his horse, propping her gently, giving her tiny sips of water so she wouldn't choke. And she watched him with eyes that were both fierce and fading. "Who left you here?" he muttered, though she didn't answer. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he knew one thing: if he left her here, even for an hour, she'd be dead. He considered taking her to the fort, but something in him recoiled at the thought. If the soldiers had abandoned her once, what would they do if he brought her back? No, she needed care, safety, and a chance to decide her own fate. When he lifted her onto his horse, she clung weakly to him, more from instinct than trust, and he felt the tremor of her exhaustion through her fingers. "You're all right," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder at her. And when her unfocused eyes met his again, he made a promise he hadn't planned to speak aloud. "You're mine now, not as property, not as something to keep, but as someone under my protection, until you can stand on your own." The words surprised him, but he meant them. No one deserved to die alone in the desert. The woman blinked, perhaps sensing his sincerity, and Jed nudged his horse toward the distant outline of an abandoned homestead he knew, an old place with a working well where he could shelter her for a couple days without drawing attention. As he rode, the shadows lengthened and a storm brewed on the horizon. But Jed rode straight into it, with the woman held securely in his arms, knowing that whatever this unexpected journey was turning into, he couldn't turn back now, and the desert, so quiet, so cruel, seemed to hold its breath as if aware that something had shifted. A cowboy riding with a broken stranger in his arms, and a fate neither of them could yet imagine. The abandoned homestead creaked with every gust of wind as night fell, its rough-hewn boards moaning like tired ghosts, but Jed made it feel like a sanctuary as best he could, lighting a fire in the stone hearth, fetching water from the well, grinding jerky into broth so the woman could swallow it without choking, and wrapping her in a blanket he normally used for his horse. As he worked, he kept glancing at her, wary of pushing too hard, but also struck by the resilience flickering behind her exhaustion. And by dawn she was able to sit upright, though her breathing still sounded like a battle. She watched him with cautious eyes, her hand hovering near a splintered stick she'd taken from the floor. Her makeshift weapon, which made Jed smiled faintly because that at least told him the fire inside her wasn't gone. "If you're fixin' to stab me," he said gently as he brewed tea over the fire, "aim for the left side. I got an old injury there. Hurts like the devil already." She didn't understand the words, but the tone was disarming enough that she didn't raise the stick. And after a moment she lowered it entirely, though still keeping it within reach. Jed realized he needed a way to communicate, so he pointed to himself and said, "Jed," tapping his chest, repeating it until she seemed to grasp the meaning. Then he gestured to her, waiting. She hesitated, gaze drifting to the fire, then whispered a single word, "Naeli?" The name sounded like a fragile flame in the air, yet it held strength, and Jed nodded with a respectful tilt of his head. Over the next hours, he focused on blanket, stepping back whenever she looked overwhelmed, and slowly the tension between them softened into something cautious but real. As the morning stretched on, he checked outside, scanning for soldiers or scouts, but the desert stayed silent, except for the circling of distant hawks. When he returned inside, he found Naeli studying the open door of the homestead, as if calculating her chances of escape. And though he knew he could physically stop her, he didn't move to block her path. Instead, he said softly, "You're free to go if that's what you want. But the desert will kill you quicker than any soldier." She paused, torn between instinctive fear and the undeniable truth in his voice. Jed stepped back further, raising his hands. "You're not a prisoner here. Not to me." Her shoulders eased a fraction, and she stepped away from the door, choosing for now to stay. Through the day, her strength returned little by little, and as she rested, Jed told her stories even though she couldn't understand. He talked about why he wandered, about the war he'd fought in, and the things he wished he could forget, about how he no longer trusted uniforms or governments to define right and wrong. And though Naeli didn't grasp the words, she seemed to understand the emotion beneath them, responding with quiet attention, her eyes soft but still vigilant. In the late afternoon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, the shape of riders. Jed's pulse quickened. Soldiers, maybe scouts from the fort, maybe men looking for someone to blame or claim. He doused the fire, guided Naeli into the shadows and whispered, "Stay behind me." She gripped his arm, not out of fear exactly, but out of understanding that whatever danger approached, they now stood in it together. The riders passed in the distance, never breaking toward the homestead. But the moment carved something unspoken between them, trust forged not by words, but by shared danger. As night crept in again, Naeli finally found enough English to murmur, "Why, you help me?" Jed looked at her for a long moment, searching for the right answer and finding only the truth. "Because someone should have. Because leaving you there would have made me no better than the men who did it." She studied him, her expression unreadable, then touched her hand lightly to his chest, not as a claim, but as acknowledgement. The gesture struck him deeper than he expected. "You're safe with me," he said. The same promise he'd made before, but this time not out of impulse, but conviction. "You're mine now, not owned, not bound, but under my protection for as long as you choose." Naeli held his gaze, understanding the meaning behind the words, and nodded slowly. The fire crackled. The wind hummed through the boards, and somewhere in the vast, dark desert outside, destiny shifted again as two souls, once strangers, once enemies by the rules of nations, found themselves allied by survival, respect, and the quiet beginnings of trust. Their journey had only just begun, but the frontier had already changed them both, and whatever came next, they would face it together.